Hello and welcome to my talk, and thank you for coming. My name is Anthony Picot. I work at Manchester Metropolitan University on the MA in TESOL and Applied Linguistics. I'm also on the committee for TESOL, a continuing professional development TESOL teachers charity since 1984. This is a recording, or you could pop your comments and questions into the chat and I'll try to answer them as we go. Today, I'd like to talk to you about my efforts to produce a workable framework for analysing the lexical errors in language learners' compositions. That is, a way of systematically identifying and categorising the type and frequency of a wide range of lexical errors. I'm going to start with a justification for lexical error analysis, then contextualize a little by explaining the stages of error analysis and its inherent problems and possible solutions. I'll then present the new framework and guidance for its use. I'll explain how the framework was created and tested, and I'll show the results I found when using it, and then make some suggestions for next steps. So, why lexical error analysis? Well, first reason, a focus on accuracy, I believe, is required. In recent years, in the literature on methodology, we have seen a justifiable shift to fluency-based language teaching approaches, such as task-based learning, a shift in focus from accuracy to fluency. It's widely agreed that getting one's message across is of greater importance than saying it with absolute accuracy. True enough. However, it's also my belief that a focus on accuracy fits in well as a post-task stage and should also be included. Indeed, it's my experience that students are very interested in their own output and the errors that they make, not least so that they can perform well in high-stakes tests. Indeed, gatekeeping institutions such as IELTS, TOEFL, TOEIC, and other high-stakes tests place great importance on the accuracy of student speaking and writing. Looking at the marking criteria for the IELTS tests, writing, there is a column in the band descriptors for lexical resource. But perhaps more guidance is needed to fully explain some of the criteria, such as control of word formation or distorting the message, etc., etc. So, despite a shift in the literature towards fluency approaches, a focus on accuracy is still very much a requirement, albeit not a very clear one. The second one, perhaps we need a better understanding of lexical ability if we are to do this. We need some kind of systematic method for the identification of lexical errors. Indeed, what is a lexical error? We'll come to that shortly. Carl James offers very good reasons why lexical errors are of particular significance and why lexical error analysis should be undertaken. First of all, in the literature, we've seen a greater focus on collocation and multi-word units and their centrality to native-like fluency. Lexis is taking a more central role in language study. Next, Lexis carries a much greater communicative function than other language systems. For example, if I simply say pen, you'd probably ascertain that I would like to borrow your pen, but you probably wouldn't want to give it to me. Lexical errors have been proved to account for the greatest percentage of errors in student output, and native speakers consider lexical errors to be the most disruptive and irritating of all error types, according to Santos. And according to Carter, these are less tolerated than syntax errors outside the classroom, as lexical errors contain content words. Another reason for lexical error analysis is remedial teaching. We should be able to thoroughly and systematically analyse the lexical errors which our students make, because surely teachers should look at student output and design at least part of their lessons around it. Materials writing can be informed by lexical error analysis. If we are fully aware of the types and frequency of errors that students make, materials could be improved to raise awareness of them so that students could avoid making them. Lexical error analysis can also inform second language acquisition research. Augustin Lach found that there were reductions in lexical errors as learners progressed over the years, and that there was a strong effect of lexical errors on assessments of writing quality. She discovered a move from form-based errors to meaning-based errors as proficiency developed. According to Carter, research into lexical errors may shed light onto how the lexicon is organized in our minds. And finally, is there similarity across contexts? Systematic lexical error analysis procedures would allow us to investigate a rather intriguing claim made by Hemchuer and Schmidt in 2006. They said, "We believe that the lexical errors made by our Thai students may be indicative of lexical problems of other learners." Now, if it is the case that the majority of second language learners make very similar lexical errors, then these should be investigated to establish their type and frequency. To my mind, it has not yet been scientifically decided whether lexical error analysis is a viable tool for teachers and researchers. There exists a gap in the literature that I hope to fill. So this is the rationale for my investigations. Error analysis is not a new concept in language teaching and learning and second language acquisition research. It's actually been around since the late 60s, but it fell out of favour for the reasons we look at next. According to Stephen Picot, who was often credited as being the creator of error analysis, these are the stages. First, collection of errors. It's a good idea to use an essay composed under exam conditions, where students have the time to redraft, but without recourse to a dictionary or other sources of help. This will produce a sample that better reflects their ability, and there'll be less chance of the sample containing mistakes, such as basic spelling mistakes, as opposed to real errors. The next stage is error identification, and this is perhaps one of the most problematic stages of error analysis for three reasons. First of all, I just mentioned, we want to identify errors, not mistakes, or slips of the tongue or slips of the pen. And it was Chomsky that first pointed out the difference between mistakes and errors by stating that mistakes are due to performance factors and errors are due to competency. More guidance on this later. However, the main issue that I've found is subjectivity. For example, different analysts may have different interpretations of acceptability in terms of formality in academic writing. Also, error analysis compares student accuracy of output with a prescriptivist correctness, some perceived satisfactory norm in terms of a variety of English, which may seem unfair and smacks of the comparative fallacy or native speakerism. However, this does not help us with the issue of standardizing high-stakes test marking and helping the students to understand where to improve, and they do want to improve. The third problem with error identification is focusing on lexical or grammatical errors and separating these out. This can be quite problematic, especially with a modern view of language as lexicogrammar. It's clear that guidance on identification is required if results are to be replicable. But again, more on this later. The next stage is description of errors, classification and quantification. It's important to have a framework of possible errors that can be used to classify them by type. This will enable error counting also. It is this that enables researchers and teachers to identify language learning issues at any stage of development and analyse how changes in error patterns occur over time. Another inherent problem is that with previous frameworks or taxonomies of error types, it has been possible to allocate errors to more than one category. For example, if a Thai learner of English utters "not like dogs," this can be categorized by causality, such as direct translation from the first language, but it could also be categorized as an error with subject and auxiliary verb omission. We need categories that are mutually exclusive. Number 4, explanation of errors. Now, some authors believe that we must then explain how the errors occurred. And there are a number of possibilities here. They could be due to first language interference. They could be due to students not yet having learned an item. There are rule overgeneralization errors, such as he goed, or errors caused by poor teaching or faulty materials. But as you can imagine, explaining causality confidently is problematic and unscientific. It is my opinion that this is not a necessary step in error analysis and should be abandoned because of its difficulties, and because identifying causality is of limited value anyway. Furthermore, surely the students themselves, after the error had been pointed out to them, would be better placed to state why it occurred rather than be told. The final stage is evaluation of errors. This is where we consider whether some errors are more problematic than others. This stage allows us to decide which errors to focus upon for remedial teaching. The more serious errors can be considered to be those where meaning breaks down. However, the choice of which errors to focus upon will be determined by context. For example, if student learning is assessed by an end-of-course grammar test, then grammatical item errors will be worthy of remedial teaching. However, if the teaching is intended to prepare the student for integration into a speech community, then a focus on natural language use would be beneficial. For these reasons, evaluation of errors could be left to the analyst teacher working in a particular context and needn't be part of a prescribed process of error analysis. So, these are the stages and inherent issues. While some issues may seem to be particularly problematic, solutions can be found, and I feel we shouldn't abandon error analysis. It would be another case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And some authors, more recently, including Al-Crochet in 2016, feel that, quote, despite the criticism that error analysis has received, it still plays a fundamental role in investigating, identifying, and describing second language learners' errors. Furthermore, despite the perceived failings and demise of error analysis, there has been a rising interest in the process recently. Hopefully, some of these issues have been addressed in the framework I will present next. In this next section, I'm going to present version 3 of the Lexical Error Analysis Framework and its accompanying guidance. The main stages of the framework involve identification and categorization. So let's start with identification. Analysts are provided with a definition of a lexical error. So, a written lexical error is a lexical form or combination of forms which would not normally be made by a highly skilled language user when writing in the same genre. I'm trying to avoid using the term native speaker here. As mentioned earlier, identification is probably the trickiest part of lexical error analysis, as it can be quite subjective. However, here is some guidance to help achieve what we call inter-rater reliability, two analysts getting the same results when using the framework and language sample. First, one must underline all of the lexical errors, which includes either single words or only the erroneous parts of the whole phrases. So, for example, in the attempt at the idiom, it was raining with the dogs and the cat, with the dogs and the cat would be the lexical error there. It would be a bit messy to unpick that one into individual errors. So this is an example of a phrase error. Analysts are asked to ignore any errors with paragraphing, with organization, grammar, and punctuation, including capitalization. But separating out grammar errors can be problematic. So, for the purposes of lexical error analysis, the following rules are used to exclude errors which can be considered wholly grammatical. And this list is adapted from Hemchua and Schmidt 2006. Exclude errors with articles, subject-verb agreement, any errors with plurals, tense, determiners, the infinitive to, the gerund, the genitive case, possessive s, comparative, superlatives, clause errors, including relative clause errors, countability, and auxiliary verbs. Now, I do recognize that to consistently apply these rules, one needs to be quite confident with one's grammatical understanding of the language. But examples are included, and perhaps this is a prerequisite for teachers of English where this framework may be used anyway. Next, counting errors can be an issue, so there's some guidance there too. Do include errors of word order in common expressions, also errors of variety there, especially when using samples from English for academic purposes, as markers tend not to like people switching between different varieties of English. I feel we should include errors of political correctness. For example, the lexical item, coloured people, is unacceptable. Let's support the social justice in language education movement. Exclude language like that, and exclude language that you don't really think is wrong, but where you might have written things differently yourself. And finally, analysts are asked to check twice for errors and refer to the guidance during the analysis. The next stage is the categorization stage, and this is the framework itself. You'll see there are two axes. In the left-hand column is what I'm calling the error type, different types of errors down the left-hand column here. And over here in the vertical axes, over on the right, we have what we call 4-column headings for errors of omission, where words or letters have been left out. There's over-inclusion, where they have been erroneously put in. There's misselection, where the wrong words or letters have been included. And misorder, where words or letters have been sequenced incorrectly. In the error type column, it's broken down into two broad areas, as many previous frameworks have been. It's broken down into form for section A, and section B is meaning. Oh, by the way, these 4 areas here in the right-hand side, these are known as a surface level taxonomy, and they come from the original error analysis framework produced by Stephen Picot. However, categorizing errors using these 4 errors alone does not give a satisfactorily detailed account of the wide variety of error types that can be made. We need the error type categories on the left also, and it was Carl James that first proposed this. So then, looking at the error types, the first 2 types are suffixes and prefixes, quite common errors there. Students often make errors with word families. So he might say the data were analysed instead of analysed. Just looking at the numbering system over here also. It's very important. Let's see, it's very important. That would be an error type 1, a missing prefix. It's very important. An example of an over-inclusion of a suffix would be he's impatient. We don't want the in there. An example of number 3 would be the jigsaw was impossible. And of course, we can't have a misordered suffix when there's only one used, so that's not applicable. Some of these error types in the left-hand column, by the way, were taken from Hemchua and Schmidt 2006, and they got their error types from James, Carl James, who was informed by Geoffrey Leach and Betty Lowther's synformic confusions. So you see, the current framework is based on previous attempts and not a figment of my own fantasy. Going back to these error types, you can see there's a category there for spelling. The next two words should be one word should be two. Some students make errors in these areas. For example, everyone should be one word, not two. Moving on to section B. Category B1 is quite an important category. As language errors, we put language errors here where we don't understand the meaning. Errors where communication is interrupted, meaning breaks down. And these could be one word or phrase errors. The framework is then subdivided into errors with single words here at the top, and errors which span across more than one word. Let's look at errors with single words first. It was Jack Richards who recommended analysing error by word class, as there'd be less possibility for dual categorisation. So we can have errors with conjunctions, we can have errors with nouns, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, and again, there could be an omission, over-inclusion, misselection, or misordering in any of these word class error areas. We can include errors with prepositions, very common there. We can include errors of time and place. I know some people consider those to be grammatical. I don't. And of course, there are errors with problematic phrasal verbs, where the errors with the particle or the preposition. Moving on to errors that span across more than one word. Category B3, phrase error, is where we categorise inseparable errors in a phrase or multi-word unit, and whole problematic phrases that require rewriting. It's a very common area. B3, misordering in fixed phrases, not particularly common. For example, you may have, do we have pepper and salt? Then we have verbosity. This can be quite common. Too many words are used or points are repeated unnecessarily. And the opposite to this is underspecification, where meaning is clear, but more words are required to satisfactorily make a point. Formality is quite a common area in academic writing. Students might seem overly formal in an email also. The final category acts as a possible miscellaneous category if analysts feel the error cannot be categorized elsewhere. There is some further advice here to help people deal with the possibility of dual categorization. Just up at the top there. We don't really have time to go through that. So what we have is a rather complex system of identification and categorization rules, but these had to be established to ensure a degree of inter-rater reliability, to ensure analysts were doing it the same way. And this would add reliability to second language acquisition studies also. However, single teachers using this framework to analyse their own students' work would soon build up what we call intra-rater reliability, so someone doing it the same way themselves consistently. It is still possible, I'm sure, that this framework will perhaps not produce identical results every time when used with the same piece of work by different analysts, particularly first-time users, as there are many rules to remember. However, with close adherence to the rules, margins for dissimilarity can be reduced to single-figure percentage numbers. So this is framework version 3. It's developed by trial and error, and I'd like to next explain how it was created and refined in order to overcome the problems that were encountered in earlier versions. So version 1 of the framework was created following an examination of the previously published lexical error analysis frameworks. They were evaluated for potential ease of use and the depth of results which they may produce. And when I say ease of use, whether there would be issues with dual categorization, for example, and depth of analysis, means just that. Do we get an interestingly wide spectrum of the different possible lexical errors which could be made? It was tested on 20 essays and refined by myself. Then 2 studies were completed. In the first, 6 highly qualified and highly experienced practicing TESOL EAP teachers. They were also highly skilled users of English. They were asked to use the framework. They were then interviewed. I asked them about what they thought about the framework, how it could be used. I asked them about ease of use, depth of analysis. And I also analysed the percentage agreement figures for identification and categorisation. This information was then used to produce version 2, which was then trialled on a wider number, about 41 practicing TESOL teachers and linguists and students of TESOL and linguists. They were asked to use the framework and guidance, and again I looked at the percentage similarity of identification and classification, and further refinements were made to produce version 3 that we've just looked at. Version 3 was tested on 20 essays by Greek learners, and fortunately there were no instances where an error was uncategorizable, and there were no issues with possible dual categorization. So next, I'd like to share with you the results of the lexical error analysis using the 20 scripts from Greek learners. These students were enrolled in a private language school in Athens, studying for IELTS. They were about IELTS 5 to 6 on average. They'd been taught English for approximately 8 years for 2 hours a week. Their essay brief was, should a government be able to restrict the number of children that a family has? Participants' ages ranged from 18 to 26 years old. They were a mixture of males and females. They had little English writing experience in their primary and secondary schools, but had received some instruction in how to structure an essay, particularly the type of discursive essay we used for the data. They were asked to write 300 to 350 words without consulting their dictionary, and they had an hour and a half. Results were as follows. So, as you can see from the table, there were 286 lexical errors in the 20 scripts. The most common were phrase errors, 77 in total, making up just over a quarter of all errors. These, remember, were phrases that contained odd lexical choices where the error spanned across a few words. Unsurprisingly, errors with prepositions were quite common, 14%. The next most common error category was errors with verbs and then nouns. And of these top 4 categories, misselection was the greatest issue. In fact, there were 17 errors where the meaning could not be understood. That's the coherence category. And these would be the most serious errors. Then we have errors with suffixes. I'm sure we're all familiar with word family errors. So, as you can see, the top 7 categories accounted for about 83% of all the errors made. We then tail off into single figures after this. Surprisingly, there were very few spelling errors, and 3 categories were not represented at all. I'm pleased to say there were no errors that could not be categorized by the framework. So, there you have it. Those are the results. Conclusion then, to ensure agreement when used by different analysts, the guidance and framework have to be followed closely, which can be tricky given the number of rules to follow. It's rather complex, isn't it? I've also found that better inter-rater agreement results are achieved when it's used by groups of highly qualified and highly experienced teachers who are also expert users of the language. Of course, it would be useful to further test the framework, but at some point, the cycle of test and improve has to stop. I think it's now ready to be used on different nationality groups to further test it. I hope to use it on the pre-sessional students when they arrive at the university this summer. I'm hoping it could be tested on different proficiency levels with different genres of writing. So it'd be great if there could be replication studies and comparison of findings. And only then will we be able to paint a clear picture of the types and frequency of lexical errors and decide whether students from different nationalities do indeed make similar lexical errors in terms of type and frequency. So, thank you for listening. Here are my references.